Hello everybody and welcome once again to ThursDev. I'm your host Luke, and today we're going to be doing just a fun little jaunt into the world of early games to take a look at just how profoundly flawed some of the classics that we know and love truly are. We have a tendency to look at the games that we grew up with as being sort of infallible, or at least not terrible. In comparison, and perhaps as somebody who makes games I'm more sensitive to this sort of thing, everything that's released in the present day seems to be under a microscope, and when things don't work as expected, they're ridiculed for that. The ignorance of the general gaming public isn't exactly a secret, of course. Listening to the arguments made about how certain things could be fixed proves out a fundamental lack of knowledge about the processes required to fix certain issues and the limitations of any given platform and/or engine. Regardless of the criticism aimed at modern game releases, however, even games that started out, and in many cases to this day remain extremely buggy, once that initial shock wears off, can become beloved classics, like Bethesda's Fallout games or Red Dead Redemption, and those games had glaring issues. The point of the matter is, if it's a fun game, ultimately, the enjoyment of the game will far outweigh its flaws. And in no classic game is that more evident than in the original NES Final Fantasy. It was perhaps the perception of things working the way that they should that really allowed this game to make it past reviewers and into the hearts of gamers relatively unscathed. It was also useful that the internet echo chamber that exists today wasn't around to draw more attention to the bugs of the game than necessary, but either way, though it was a profoundly buggy game, it's still remembered fondly to the present day. In my video about QA, I mentioned that no modern game ships without some bugs. No matter how benign, there will be something in there that doesn't work quite as intended. In game development, we typically categorize bugs into severity from a level of A to D, with an A bug being something like the game crashing or completely wiping the data on your hard drive, to a D being a strange graphical issue that has no actual bearing on the game. D bugs are the kind of issue that a developer will spend time squashing when they need to take a break from debugging larger issues, as A bugs take priority. Most games usually don't ship with A-bugs, or at least not A-bugs that the developers are aware of. This isn't always the case, but as a general rule, a publisher won't knowingly publish an A-bug, and a platform licensor like Sony, Microsoft, or Nintendo won't allow a game with an A-bug to ship on their platform. B-bugs, bugs that have significant effects on gameplay, cause the intended design to fail, or have results that are largely different from the established expectation, sometimes do, however, sneak in. Final Fantasy had a few of those. Not all the bugs are bad for the player, I should note. I'd like to take a look at some of the bugs that the player might come across of both types. As noted in the previous video, Final Fantasy ultimately was little more than a lot of wandering around as diversions between fights. The basic concepts of combat were always fairly simple, but unfortunately some of the implementations of actual effects in combat didn't behave as expected. Attack damage is supposed to be based on strength, but instead only really looks at the weapon damage of items equipped to each character. This means that as long as an item can be equipped to a character, it won't do any more or less damage than any other class, with the noted exception of the Black Belt Martial Artist class, which adds 1/2 of their strength rounded up when they have a weapon equipped. This means that ultimately it's a better idea to focus on characters that can equip more weapons than the actual stats of the characters in many cases. On top of weapon damage, critical chance is also meant to be calculated by a weapon's crit rating, which is defined in code as a value of 1 to 30, 30 only being held by the Vorpal and Katana weapons, but instead points to the weapon's index number, making the special crit weapons significantly less useful. Critical chance notwithstanding, however, even more detrimental to weapons is the fact that special damage attributes of weapons are never actually loaded, meaning that the Ice Sword doesn't deal cold damage, the Fire Sword doesn't deal fire damage, the Dragon Sword deals no more damage to dragons than any other 19 attack weapon, and so on. Magic mercifully still does inflict special damage, but equipment like the Dragon Sword, Coral Sword, Were Sword, Rune Sword, and so on are in fact less powerful than the Long Sword damage-wise, with the exception of a higher hit percentage, and of course the ever-important above-mentioned critical rate, which again was tied to the weapon's index. There are other significant possible drawbacks to these special weapons, however, as the special damage type defined by their equipped weapon defines their element for the purposes of incoming damage, so a fighter with the fire sword is more prone to fire attacks, ice for ice, and so on. Want to deal some extra damage? Don't bother with the X for spell. Monster elemental resistance is loaded into read-only memory, meaning that you can't alter the value even with a spell specifically meant to alter it. The same applies for the lock spell, as you can't lower an enemy's evasion, and the spell will always fail. Most enemy values are, in fact, stored in read-only memory actually, so this does work to your benefit when another enemy casts a spell on its allies, like Fog, which is meant to raise defense, or Aether. Poison also won't affect enemies, though Sleep will, if only for one round. Don't worry though, enemies aren't the only ones exempt from some status ailments. Dark doesn't do anything to anyone at all, which is great when you're fighting the Kraken, the Water Fiend, as one of his abilities in his rotation is Amass Dark on the Light Warriors. Don't bother with Temper or Saber. The Light Warrior defense and attack values can't be altered with magic, but do feel free to use the Fast spell, as it is very effective at adding attacks. But let's get out of combat. Running is also bugged, as it doesn't look at the character's luck stat, but instead loads other data. The top Light Warrior looks at the third Light Warrior's status, the second looks at the fourth status, the third Light Warrior looks at the third attacker in the battle's initiative order, so 0 to 8 if a monster, or 128 to 131 if a Light Warrior. And the fourth Light Warrior looks at their HP's final digit and adds it to 128. Why this happened, I can't say, but it does lead to an unfortunate additional strike against the usefulness of the Thief Ninja character, as their luck stat and crit stats are both working not as intended. It's honestly a wonder that we didn't notice something was amiss in combat as children. There's a lot going wrong in there, but the overworld has its share of quirks as well. Fortunately, most are debugs as best, like the woman in Canaria Castle whose visibility flag is set backwards and appears when the player is inside a room but is invisible when outside, or the bat in the waterfall cave that spawns outside the walls. But one to be particularly wary of is the house item, which greatly restores health and replenishes magic slots, saves the game data before restoring that magic, so if you load a save made with a house, magic will be expended as if it was before the house was used. Bring a tent to save after using a house if you are going to use one. Now, a tip for grinding before I wrap up this episode. As I mentioned in my previous video about the random encounter system in Final Fantasy, the type of enemy that you're set to fight for any given encounter is defined in the overworld by which of the 64 regions of the overworld map that you're currently standing in. The eagle-eyed among you will notice that there's a 2-square area right at the top of the peninsula north of Pravoka that pokes into the Lufine area, an ostensibly endgame area of the world map, which means that getting into an encounter in the tiny peninsula tip calls monsters from within the Lufine area monster list instead of the Pravoka area list. This means trolls and more, which can be killed effectively with powerful enough fire spells, though dangerous. This area is a fantastic place for gaining XP early in the game and can net the player multiple levels in a single go, or would if leveling didn't cap out at a single level per encounter, meaning that you'll have to go through a few encounters to catch up to the character level that you should already be based on your XP value. There are other bugs and quirks in the game, but those are some of the more glaring ones. Even with all of that, however, Final Fantasy remains a grand classic that you should absolutely give a chance at playing, especially with the game's 30th anniversary right around the corner. But let this serve as one bit of proof when people might try to convince you that games were less buggy back in the day. Believe me, they were buggy. We just didn't notice because we didn't mind as much. Thank you for joining me for this episode of ThursDev. It wasn't our usual fare, more of a lighthearted jaunt into some of the more broken parts of my favorite games, but I hope that you enjoyed it nonetheless. And if you did enjoy today's episode, I hope that you'll consider coming back again next time as well, or checking out our now fairly extensive archive of ThursDev, Serious Sundays, or plain old Let's Play videos. Regardless, thank you very much for dropping by, and I do hope that I'll see you again soon. Take care.